Assalamualaikum warahmatullahi wabarakatuh. Hello guys, we are from group 5 and today we will discuss about 18th century. Now we're going to the first material.
Okay, 18th century divided into two, and now I will explain about Augustine. Augustine sendiri itu tuh berasal dari penulis tahun 1720-an atau 1730-an yang menanggapi istilah yang disukain sama George untuk George sendiri. Sedangkan George itu tuh bermaksud judul tersebut tuh untuk mencerminkan kekuatannya, tapi tuh orang-orang malah melihat judul tersebut tuh buat refleksi transisi Roma kuno dari sastra kasar dan siap untuk sastra yang sangat politis dan sangat halus. Transisi Roma kuno itu tuh ancient Rome, itu aku udah jelasin di PPT, nanti dilihat aja. Terus dan George-nya juga aku udah jelasin di PPT. Jadi tuh Nah, di era ini adalah era kegembiraan dan skandal dari energi yang sangat besar dan daya cipta dan juga kemarahan yang mencerminkan era ketika orang-orang Inggris, Wales sama Scotland sama Irlandia, Irish people kan Irlandia, itu menemukan diri mereka tuh ada di tengah-tengah ekonomi yang berkembang, menurunkan hambatan untuk pendidikan dan awal dari revolusi industri. Revolusi industri sendiri itu tuh aku udah tulis di PPT juga apa sih revolusi industri itu. Jadi segitu aja.
Okay, now I will explain about poetry in Augustan literature. Pada masa Augustan, penyair James Thomson menghasilkan karya yang melankolis yang berjudul The Seasons pada tahun 1728 sampai 1730 dan Edward Young menulis puisinya yang berjudul Night Thought pada tahun 1742. Meskipun penyair yang paling menonjol pada zaman itu adalah Alexander Pope atau Paus Alexander. Ini juga merupakan era yang menyaksikan persaingan serius atas model yang tepat untuk pastoral. Dalam kritik, penyair berjuang dengan doktrin kesopanan, menyocokkan kata-kata yang tepat dengan pemikiran yang tepat, dan mencapai diksi yang cocok dengan gravitasi suatu subjek. Pada saat yang sama, mock heroic berada di puncaknya dan Pope's Rape of the Lock pada tahun 1712 sampai 1717 dan The Dunciad masih dianggap sebagai puisi mock heroic terbesar yang pernah ditulis. Paus juga menerjemahkan Iliad dan Odyssey. Sejak kematiannya, Paus selalu melakukan evaluasi ulang. Terima kasih. Silakan next presenter.
Drama. John Feinberg and William Congreve, both of whom carried out the Restoration comedy with some alterations. However, the majority of stagings were of lower verses and much more serious and domestic tragedies. And then George Lillo and Richard Steele both produced highly moral forms of tragedy, where the characters and the concerns of the characters were wholly middle class or working class. This reflected a marked change in the audience for plays, as royal patronage was no longer the important part of theatrical success. Collie Sibber and John Rich began to battle each other for greater and greater spectacles to present on stage. And then pantomime. The figure of Harlequin was introduced, and pantomime theater began to be staged. This slow comedy was quite popular, and the plays became tertiary to the staging. And then the last opera. Opera also began to be popular in London, and there was significant literary resistance to this Italian incursion. In 1728, John Kay returned to the playhouse with the Beggar's Opera.
Joseph Addison and Richard Steele. The Spectator established the form of the British political essay. However, this was also the time when the English novel was first emerging. Daniel Defoe turned from journalism and writing criminal lives for the press to writing fictional criminal lives with Roxana and Moll Flanders. He also wrote Robinson Crusoe. In prose, the earlier part of the period was overshadowed by the development of the English essay. However, this is also the time when the English novel was first emerging. Daniel Defoe turned from journalism and writing criminal. Jonathan Swift, author of the satire Gulliver's Travels, was in another. Henry Fielding began to write prose satire and novels after his plays couldn't pass the censor. Samuel Richardson had produced Pamela or Virtue Rewarded, and Henry Fielding attacked what he saw as the absurdity of this novel in Joseph and Rose. If Addison and Steele were dominant in one type of prose, the Jonathan Swift, author of the satire Gulliver's Travels, was in another. This provoked riots and races, but the Swift, who had no love of Irish Roman Catholics, was attracted by the abuses he saw. An effect of the Licensing Act of 1737 was to cause more than one aspiring playwright to switch over to writing novels. When 1707 until 1745, Henry Fielding began to write prose, satire, and novels.
The next slide is Age of Sensibility. This period is known as the Age of Sensibility, but it is also sometimes described as the Age of Jensen. Samuel Jensen, often referred to as Dr. Jensen, was an English author who made lasting contribution to English literature as a poet, essayist, moralist, literary critic, biographer, editor, and lexicographer. Johnson has been described as arguably the most distinguished man of letters in English history. After 9 years of work, Johnson's Dictionary of the English Language was published in 1715, and it had a far-reaching effect on modern English and has been described as one of the greatest single achievements of scholarship. The second half of the 18th century saw the emergence of three major Irish authors. There are Oliver Goldsmith, Richard Brinsley Sheridan, and Lawrence Sterne. Jadi dalam periode ini bisa dikenal sebagai Age of Johnson. Samuel Johnson adalah seorang penulis Inggris yang memberikan kontribusi abadi pada sastra Inggris sebagai penyiar, penulis esai, moralis, kritikus sastra, penulis biografi, editor, dan leksikografer. Johnson telah digambarkan sebagai bisa dibilang sastrawan paling terkemuka dalam sejarah Inggris. Setelah 9 tahun ia bekerja, karyanya Dictionary of the English Language diterbitkan pada tahun 1755 dan memiliki pengaruh yang luas pada bahasa Inggris modern dan telah digambarkan sebagai salah satu pencapaian terbesar dalam bidang beasiswa. Pada kedua abad ke-18, muncullah 3 penulis besar Irlandia, yaitu Oliver Goldsmith, Richard Brinsley Sheridan, and Lawrence Sterne. Goldsmith merupakan penulis The Vicar of Wakefield, sebuah puisi pastoral, The Deserted Village, and dua drama, The Good-Natured Man and The Troops to Conquer. Drama pertama Shireen, The Rival, dilakukan di Covent Garden and langsung sukses. Ia kemudian menjadi penulis drama London yang paling signifikan di akhir abad ke-18 dengan drama seperti The School for Scandal. Baik Goldsmith dan Sheridan bereaksi terhadap komedi sentimen teater pada abad ke-18, mendekati gaya komedi restorasi. Strand menerbitkan novel yang terkenal Tristram Shandy di bagian antara tahun 1759 dan 1767. Pada tahun 1778, Frances Burney menulis Evelina sebagai salah satu novel pertama tentang tata krama, dan novel Fanny Burney yang dinikmati dan dikagumi oleh Jane Austen.
Okay, next is characteristic of the age of sensibility. There are 4 characteristics. First is reaction in form. Second is return to nature. Third is the return of feeling. And the last is the cult of romance. There are many figures who play an important role in the age of sensibility by producing famous literary works. The first is Samuel Johnson, 1709 till 1784. Samuel Johnson, often referred to as Dr. Johnson, was an English author who made a lasting contribution to English literature as a poet, essayist, moralist, literary critic, biographer, editor, and lexicographer. That's why the second half of the 18th century is sometimes called the Age of Johnson. Johnson has been described as arguably the most distinguished man of letters in English history. After 9 years of work, Johnson's Dictionary of the English Language was published in 1755. It had a far-reaching effect on modern English and has been described as one of the greatest single achievements of scholarship. Through works such as the dictionary, his edition of Shakespeare, and his lives of the poets in particular, he helped invent what we now call English literature. The second is James Thomson, 1700 till 1748. Thomson was a Scottish poet endowed with a love and appreciation for nature and the dreamy life of the Middle Ages. His poem, The Seasons, introduced for the first time genuine love for nature. It's a blank verse poem with the descriptive passages dealing with natural scenes, mainly those with which he was familiar during his youth on the Scottish border. The poem exerted a strong counter-influence against the artificial school of poetry. Thomson's The Castle of Indolence was published in the last year of his life. The poem is in the Spenserian stanza, and in the true Spenserian fashion it gives a description of a lotus land, into which word weary souls are invited to withdraw. Thomson gave voice to deep aspiration which many shared. He restored nature to one of the first places among the subject of poetry, and to a place from which he was never to be dislodged.
The third precursor is Edward Young. Young belongs to the Graveyard School of Poetry. The notable poems of Young are The Universal Passion and Night Thoughts. The Universal Passion is a satire against fame and women. The Night Thoughts is a long meditation on the futility of life. The poem contains a series of reflections upon the brevity and tragic uncertainties of life, leading to a view of religion as man's consoler. With Young, self comes into the foreground and his work represents the real beginning of the literature of sensibility. Necessarily subjective in principle, it ends with all its might to bring about the overthrow of the barrier of the intellectuality, measure, and order, as well as the general effacement by which classism limit, repress, and transpose the troubled, impatient flow of life. The next is Oliver Goldsmith. Goldsmith shared the qualities of classicism and romanticism. Though he stood midway between the school of Pope and the Romantic school, Goldsmith was more sympathetic to the former. In his use of the heroic couplet, Goldsmith was a dedicated follower of Alexander Pope. Goldsmith retained the didactic or teaching element in his poetry, and thereby he kept up his link with Pope and his followers. His poems, The Traveller and The Deserted Village, are philosophical and didactic. Goldsmith also exhibited his power of writing satiric poetry in his Retaliation. The last precursor is Robert Burns. Robert Burns was probably the greatest of Wordsworth's forebears. With the appearance of Burns, it could be said that the day of Romanticism had come. Wordsworth's poetical works of any magnitude is his volume of poems, which he edited 5 times during his lifetime, making numerous editions and corrections each time. Burns is regarded as the national poet of Scotland. Regarding Burns' contribution to the 18th century poetry, it could be said that in spite of his feeble attachment to the school of Pope, he heralded the birth of Romanticism. The inner element of Romanticism, personal effusion, sensibility, a keen love for nature, a bit of imaginative fancy, and a sympathetic interest in the poor and the animals, are to be found in the work of Burns. And the notable works of Robert Burns are To a Mouse, Halloween, The Battle of Saramoor, and etc.